Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. Here with a special guest about a favorite topic of mine of recently. Paul, thank you so much for doing my show, man. If you want to introduce yourself to everyone out there listening.
Great. Thank you, Robbie, for having me. My name's Paul Bleau. I'm a teacher in the business program up here for a college in Quebec City. I've been very interested in the JFK assassination for decades. The first book I ever read about it was Crossfire by Jim Marrs. I love that book. And I probably read maybe about 50 books on the matter. I began writing articles for, I would call it a world-renowned website on the topic called Kennedys and King. And I've often been interviewed also on Black Op Radio. So I've written about a multitude of subjects, including how history books cover the assassination, the prior plots and attempts and the similarities to try and assassinate Kennedy. I've written about what the insiders, because there have been 6 government investigations into the case. There was a civil case, the Liberty Lobby case, that touched on the assassination, and what do the insiders, the people that were close to the investigations, what do they think? Going back from the Warren Commission all the way up to the ARRB. So I wrote a nice article, and I found an awful lot of interesting quotes and statements that show that people who don't believe in the lone nut scenario, who were insiders, think a lot more like us. They don't believe they've said things to that effect. I'm talking about the heads of certain committees, sort of like if you look at Richard Schweiker, senator for the Church Committee, and you look at Richard Sprague with the HSCA and Robert Tannenbaum, and you listen, and they're on the record of saying things. And I found many of those quotes, and I put that in an article. I've written about also something that I think you'll find fascinating is Oswald's links to the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. And what does that reveal about what was going on? Because if you understand the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, which represented some weird behavior by Oswald during the summer leading up to the assassination, what was at play there? It didn't make any sense that he would join that committee in Oswald. So anyway, I've written about a dozen articles, which got me to eventually be interviewed by Oliver Stone for his latest documentary about the prior plots for Destiny Betrayed, the documentary. And boy, I don't know if that's gives you a little bit of an idea of my involvement with the JFK assassination. I do it more as a passion,
Yeah, that's kind of how I've been with researching my own after talking to Jim and everybody, Dave Mantic. I'm trying to accumulate as much information as I possibly can from everybody. That means anybody who's ever written a book and might have conflicting views. I want to learn from every single person to understand this better. But there's 2 things I think you probably can shed some light in for me: the prior assassination attempts, but also Oswald's involvement in the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, mostly because I don't know. I know a lot of people, like I know someone who believes in the lone nut theory or lone gunman theory, someone who's been to that book suppository building and says, just stand there and you'll know that one guy could easily fire off 3 shots to shoot the president. I'm like, well, what evidence does that have in court? And like, what evidence would that have that could, that any person, I mean, I don't know every person that can make a shot like that, but let's roll with that. So a lot of this is like hypotheticals when it comes to, okay, if this is possible, if you believe that this is this, or you believe the Zapruder film was this or that, whether it was or not, I want to base in what we have right now, information wise. And a quick assumption from any documentary that I've started to learn through doing my own research has been that everyone has depicted Oswald as this kid that wasn't loved, as this kid that his parents weren't around and he just seemed like he was a mischievous boy. Now, all right, at that point, I'm like, what history of Oswald is out there? What would his involvement be? Apparently he was spotted in Mexico. So then I get to this point where I'm going to pull up on screen here for what I just said a minute ago about Oswald not being loved by his family. Now, this file that I'm looking at here is doc ID 323577059. And if you can see what I see on the screen, it says a letter to Mr. Richard Hume, or yeah, it's Humes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
No, Helms, Richard Helms.
Helms, Deputy Director of Plans, dated 17th of March, 1964, from J. Lee Rankin, General Counsel. Now, this second part right here is what I wanted to highlight. It says copies of letter written by Lee Harvey Oswald to his mother, Margaret Oswald, when he was living in the Soviet Union. So anybody that doesn't have a good relationship and feels like your parents betrayed him, more likely than not, you're probably not writing to your parents. So this was like a first spark in my head of like, hey, maybe they're trying to pin him or trying to go towards the lone gunman theory in these records and make him to be the enemy by, but what sucks is a lot of those documentaries that said that are newer documentaries. So that means history isn't getting that correct. And there isn't questions being asked, which I've seen you write an article about history's take on this. Seems to not be necessarily accurate in a sense when it comes to the fact of how historians remember it or how people are choosing to teach it. Now, I know it's a very, very controversial topic. I know there's a lot of stuff about it when it comes to just issues that people have. I'm trying to see, here's the report pulling up right here, doc 323 41711. And I mean, I'm not trying to be all sporadic with all the information here, but this is how I've been coming across this, looking at the 2020 release documents that we all are available to see now. And this was saying that the first information they saw from Oswald came from a technical operation in Mexico City, was cabled in on 9th of October, 1963. It revealed that the 1st of October, 1963, Lee Oswald had been found in touch there with the Soviet Union Valley, and I don't know that agent's names, but about a telegram which a Soviet embassy was supposed to send to him to the Soviet embassy. Now, I've heard that he was trying to take away his U.S. citizen's license and he wanted to do all this, and then he kind of went back on it and went back to the States. But there was another article in my email I have right here that I want to pull up, and it's another one that probably people didn't hear a lot about. And I know I've seen a couple of documentaries about him now that stated he was in Mexico, but never saw the other file that was dated later on in 75 that stated, no, it was a lookalike. Now, my thing is, I'm seeing him go from Russia to Mexico to all these different places, whether the time span was all this. I'm like, unless he has some new technology to travel so fast, it's just not adding up. Where I start going, how many kids now have a hipster hairstyle? How many kids now have the same exact clothing as the other person? Is it possible that this person that might have photographed Oswald outside of the thing might have been someone that just looked like Oswald? Nope. That just crossed my mind. Maybe it's not true. But I'm just saying these are things that need to be thought about. But when you're at such a rapid pace to cover up this thing with a fancy bow, a magic bullet, or one lone person is going to be the only direction that you're going to look towards, which means that any evidence that you can find or any made up evidence is what you're going to be going for. Am I somewhat getting the basis of what's happening here? If I'm crazy, just tell me.
No, you're first of all, just in the documents that you showed, right? Couple of things, and I'm going to preface this. I believe there's about 10 to 12 chokeholds where you can say, when you look at this, even if Oswald may have made the shot, I mean, we're talking about a conspiracy, right? So making the shot, whether you made it or not, doesn't explain necessarily that there was no conspiracy, right? Because conspiracy, the second you have more than one person involved in the plot to assassinate Kennedy, whether there's a shooter, an enabler, or whatnot, you have a conspiracy. Now, let's take this Mexico City situation, which occurred, I believe, in October, end of September, October. Apparently, Oswald would have gone to Mexico City in an attempt to make it to Cuba. Now, here's the thing. It is clear that there was an impersonator, and it's a fact. There's no doubt about it. And here's how it can be proven. And Jim DiEugenio wrote an article about this. You can hear Hoover on a tape saying to Lyndon Johnson, because you see, when Oswald was in Mexico City, he was to have made calls from the Cuban embassy to the Russian embassy. And those calls were recorded. And those calls were overheard. And they were listened to after the assassination by FBI agents who had gone to Dallas to interview, because Oswald survived 2 days, right? And he'd been interviewed for many, many hours. And while there, or before, the FBI and at least 8 or 9 people heard the tapes, or some of the tapes, of Oswald talking to people in the Russian consulate or embassy. I forget what it is, but anyway. And they said, hey, look, the voice on the tape is not Oswald's. Now, while he was there, you have to keep in mind that you had cameras, right? Multiple cameras, also photographing Oswald as he's entering the Cuban consulates and the Russian ones. Now, all the cameras somehow would not have worked. Okay, these were, cameras that would be activated simply by motion activation. So they have no explanation as to why those cameras did not work. So, normally you would have had photographs of Oswald entering these buildings. So everything around the Mexico stinks to high heaven. And when you cannot come to any other conclusion that he was impersonated that. Now, that doesn't mean he didn't go, okay, or he wasn't there, but there's definitely someone saying incriminating things about Oswald, saying things on the tape, or because the transcripts survived. Okay, some people wrote transcripts, Russian interpreters in Mexico, and he spoke Russian so horridly on those tapes, and it clearly wasn't his voice. So the next thing you need notice on one of the documents, you saw the name Kostatov.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, are you aware a little bit who he is?
Mm-mm.
Okay, Kostatov, the story came out was that he was head of Russian assassinations for the Western Hemisphere. So the whole idea was to create a story, a scenario where Oswald was talking to the head of assassinations not long before the assassination. Because the whole part A of the plot, plan A, was not a no-no. Plan A was, Oswald is in cahoots, because there's multiple reports of Oswald that ended up all being phony, of meeting Cuban agents, trying to talk to the Russian head of assassinations, Kostatov. If you look up his name, you'll see all the story around him. And even the CIA saying, oh boy, this guy is, the head of assassinations. And anyway, when they had to go to plan B, because Johnson didn't want to go into a war with Cuba and invade and say, hey, we have proof that they're behind this. The missile crisis was a year earlier, right? And they didn't want to go in that direction. So they had to go the lone nut route. And that's where all these traces and everything became a huge problem. So That is, by the way, Robbie, in my view, one of the biggest chokeholds is Oswald, what he did in Mexico, or supposedly did. And if you read Jim's article on that, you'll see that there's no doubt that he was impersonated. So what's his story about impersonating a lone nut, a drifter? Does make sense.
So here's another file that was released, which says right here, a photo of unidentified man was taken in front of the Soviet embassy in Mexico. This photo was taken by Station Mexico photo surveillance of the Soviet embassy during the month of October 1963. When news of the arrest of Oswald as Kennedy's assassin became known, the station immediately forwarded copies of the photo to the FBI, and the mistaken assumption that the photo was of Oswald taken while he was in Mexico that fall. It was later determined that the photo was not of Oswald, and in fact had been taken after he had departed Mexico. Oswald was in Mexico from the 26th of September through the 3rd of October 1963. Even though the photo was not of Oswald, it had been taken and shown to Oswald's wife and mother with the background partially cropped in an effort to disguise the place where the photo had been taken. The photo became somewhat of an issue when the Warren Commission decided it belonged in the report as part of an exhibit since it had been shown to Oswald's. Now, here we go where I start saying, this is how you get your family to turn on you. If you have a photo that's cropped in a certain way or might not show a person's face, but it looks like maybe your son, for instance, especially if they want to round up this theory or this idea that Oswald wasn't loved by his family and wasn't loved by whatever, was just a misfit child, then maybe his mother wouldn't recognize that it wasn't Oswald. But the photos, when they crop them, this is how you get your family to say, well, maybe he did do it. And then they turn on you. And then you immediately lose all hope in the people that are supposed to trust you.
Robbie, can I cut you off if I may? Have you seen that photo?
I haven't seen that photo.
Okay, that photo is widely available. You can find it. And it doesn't look an ounce like Oswald. So that created a huge problem. If you look at it, Oswald impersonation, the person may have even have been identified. And go to images, probably. I'll show you. Scroll down. No, so if you look, if you put Oswald imposter photo in Mexico, try that. Oswald imposter photo. There.
This one?
Okay, you see the guy on the left? That's the guy.
This guy right here?
No. Go to the second photo to your left, top left.
This one?
Yes, that's our guy. Okay, he's supposed to be Oswald. Now, I mean,
that doesn't look anything like him.
No.
Well, see, this photo right here, this one right here is the one that they say that's how they know that Oswald did it. It's the same rifle and everything like that. But Oswald had mentioned saying that this photo was cropped.
Yes.
The top of his face was cropped. So now, doing my own research, like I said, I have a document right here that says, following is an excerpt from the page 364 from the Warren Commission report. It says affidavits obtained from the CIA and from the two FBI agents who trimmed the photograph established that the one shown to Miss Oswald before the commission through trimmed differently from the one shown to her on November 23rd was a copy of the same picture. Neither picture was of Jack Ruby. So I don't understand, where are they talking about this photo of Jack Ruby? Because I couldn't find the terms that they were using to disguise this, unless they were talking about the photo where Oswald said that his face was cropped. So I just go, did they show a photo of Oswald, the same photo that maybe that they had of Oswald already with the rifle, and then they showed another photo showing, see, it's the same exact rifle, just different shirts or something? But then I've seen people talk about how they've done simulations to prove that it was that person. And I'm just like, it's so like, I understand everybody's investment, much like I'm getting invested into this, to have their own kind of research and information and say, this is how I came across it, so this must be true. But I'm like, it's got to be something bigger than that. Like, we all have to really put our resources together here to show that obviously the Warren Commission was lying and trying to pin it on one specific thing. Whether that was to avoid war with Cuba, they were implementing Russia in a huge way. which means were they going back into war with Russia? Was it going to be more than a Cold War? Was it going to be something that was going to advance farther? I mean, I don't mean to take us in a weird direction in this chat, but I'm coming across this information and I'm 24 and I'm new to this. And I can see that there's a lot of stuff that just isn't making sense. There's a lot of psychological issues, which made me dig deeper into Oswald's past. And what I came across was that there was another person that Oswald killed that day, apparently, allegedly killed. Now, if you read up the Tibbetts case, the way that it's documented, and whether you want to read it through Wikipedia or whatever, any other person who wrote an article about it says that they saw a man with the same backpack as Oswald, but every single person that saw that said there's no way a rifle could have fit in there, which is the one why he left it at the plaza. But the gun that he also had with him, a small little rifle or revolver. Now, the guy who saw him and said that that's Oswald said that he fired 3 shots, and they can tell by the 2 cases. Now, I'm not a mathematician, but they just said they heard 3 shots and that they can add it up through 2 cases. So I go, how do you, so now you're just going off of this person's idea that there's 3 shots being fired, but you only have evidence of 2 cases. And there's just a lot of, like, even with Tibbetts, which really sucks for him, is because they only give him a paragraph on a Wikipedia. Like, they didn't care because everybody was more worried about President Kennedy at that time. And I figured that if they could say that Oswald killed this cop or this person, and you have someone that might have seen it, might not have, I don't know. But it's really easy to just lock them away even more if you can pin 2 deaths on them, one being the president and one being something else. Now, I know you're laughing. I can't tell if maybe I'm going crazy.
No. I'm not laughing. It's because if you're someone who's trying to, you realize how many things have to go right for Oswald to be a lone nut here. It's the 3 perfect shots, including one that caused 7 wounds, right? One that caused 5 wounds to Connolly and 2 to Kennedy. Then you get the headshot, and then you have the 3rd shot that hits a bystander, and then you have to. I mean, there's so many things that you say, well, wait, if there's an imposter of Oswald in Mexico City, you've got a conspiracy. If the photos you've shown, which, by the way, if you look at that photo, what's intriguing is it's so convenient, right? Because he's got his Carcano in one hand, and he's got the pistol that killed Tippett in the other hand, and he's got papers, militant, to show I'm a communist. So, if you look at the photo, I'm a communist, here's my gun and here's my rifle. And, so that's why I chuckle when I see some of these things. And the crop line seems to be right here. And if you look at because there are 4 photos, right? There are 4 photos of him in the backyard photos. You see a crop line, and every photo has exactly the same expression from the chin, the lips up, it looks like. And the person who would have taken the photo is Marina now, apparently, okay? But when they asked Marina to recreate how she took the photo, it was sort of a camera, a belly camera where you press from the top. She didn't know how to operate it. Okay, she could not recreate how she took the picture. See, she didn't know how to take a picture with the supposed camera that took the picture. So what you have there is something that was to frame Oswald in the eyes of the public. And that photo made it to Life magazine, right? So it was a very convenient photo. But you know what? Interesting enough, that, when I talk to you about 10 to 12 chokeholds, I don't even use that one as a chokehold. Okay, I just find it very suspicious. But I don't get bogged down in that one because, there's so many others, like the impersonation of Oswald in Mexico City causes the lone nut scenario people fits. They don't know what to say about it. They can't. They can't come up with arguments, and they end up looking ridiculous. The other one that turns them, if you want to look at some other chokeholds where you say well, I would think the prior plots. Okay, when you look at the prior plots, and you say, oh my God, there's a template here. There's a template. It's just too similar from one to the other. But go
Well,
on. That's why I'm chuckling. It's not
yeah,
because
okay. Well, I want to talk about the prior plots, but I have two things before we go into the prior plots. One, when I was speaking with Dave Mantic, I told him this is kind of like a fine wine, and he goes, "What do you mean?" I go, "When I'm reading through the JFK, I stumbled across the RFK, where I've gotten confused sometimes with talking to Jim and everybody, where I'm like, oh, that's the RFK case. They just seem so similar. My brain ends up, my algorithm, whatever, feeds me into the RFK case, but I'm smelling it when I say it's like a fine wine, and I'm picking up notes of JFK when I'm reading through Robert Kennedy's assassination. And I start going, so there has to be a template in a sense. If I'm picking up the same notes, it's good to have those instincts. And I trust my instincts on an aspect of, okay, maybe science isn't going to say that's reliable, but for me, it is because it's steered me right in every part of my life, basically. But when I go to Abraham Bolden, for instance, who hopefully I hope to get on here as well, I hear him talk about how the Secret Service members talked about, or someone in specific I heard him mention say that to kill how would you assassinate the president? I would do it from a tall building with a rifle, was the words that were said. And Bolden, being one of the first black Secret Service members, said that I think that's very, very wrong and suspicious because you're supposed to protect your president, no matter if you disagree or not. Now, he did go a little bit more into the drinking habits of the Secret Service members that day. Maybe everybody wasn't up to par. But one thing that was always recorded through history on every single document or every single documentary talked about how JFK didn't really need Secret Service members. He wanted to keep them at a distance. And I go, yeah, well, if they're talking about assassinating you or how would you do it, I wouldn't want you guarding me either. So it made me think, and here's my own little kind of thoughts in this, and they might agree, might disagree. If you start befriending someone like Abraham Bolden, you start telling him a lot of confidential stuff, where eventually they became close together, which is reported that Abraham Bolden grew close, a friendship with the president. Now you start getting into this point of, if you're only going to tell him that, if you're only going to talk to this, you're only going to talk to your family members, your brother, who's talked about, like, I think Robert Kennedy's last few words were something of the terms of, I'll probably never know what happened to my brother, or something of that sort. You start getting into this area of, like, is it conspiracy that they plotted to get rid of the president, to get someone new in the position, to go with the goals of what the whole establishment wanted? And that's kind of where everybody was going. A lot of people did not like Kennedy from the Bay of Pigs invasion. They didn't like him they thought he cost a lot of troops lives, but he even said he didn't want to do this. He was going to stop this. And nobody really kind of listened to him. They thought maybe he's just going to go with it anyway. And when he didn't do it, he was pushed to blame rather than the other people for thinking that he would change his mind or something like that. And every recorded thing, whether you listen to Eisenhower documentaries or other aspects, they all kind of say that everyone resented him for that move, or everyone kind of felt like there was a lot of eyes on him. Now, I look at this point of, if you look at JFK's background, he lose a brother in the war? Didn't he lose somebody? So already, even though you're using this to kind of gateway your presidency in a sense, to get to this platform of, I'm gonna, we're gonna, handle the war. We're gonna go to war and we're gonna end this and we're gonna win. We're gonna be America, which is the platform that he ran on. But then you see he changed his position. Well, that's how you get elected. How many people do we know that get elected now and change their position stance? And everyone's like, why did they go back on what they said? Well, it's because they were using it to get your vote, and then they got your vote, and now they're in office, and you really can't do anything about it, unless you want to impeach Nixon, you know. But what I'm saying is, if you take all these kind of like connecting the dots in a sense, and I know it's not scientifical, but this is kind of how I'm consuming this in a sense and making my own conclusion. If you lose a brother to the war, and you realize how, especially if you see all those photos of JFK looking at his kids, that's a person who realizes the destruction that this is going to do, or these moves are going to do. And it's not worth losing a little life like that might not be your own, but might be somebody else's, but there's no good that can come out of it. And I was picking up notes of that while looking at these photographs and seeing a lot of that. Now, people can say maybe that's how the picture was taken.
Well,
I'll
no,
keep.
you're right. You're absolutely right.
Okay.
In this sense, he lost a brother, but he himself, has a heroic story to tell about his World War experience, where his PT boat got hit by the Japanese patrol boat. I'm not sure what type, but anyway, he ended up swimming and pulling some of his soldiers to safety on an island for hours, and it really hurt his back. By the way, he always had back
That's why he
problems.
had the back brace in the
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, no, and other reasons too. But he he obviously, anybody who went through World War II is not looking to get into another world war. The other thing that really, really affected him was the missile crisis. He knew how close they came to a nuclear holocaust, both he and Khrushchev. And for sure that, this whole, warmongering, he was not comfortable with. And he was being pushed and pushed by people like Curtis LeMay during the negotiations during the missile crisis, saying, you got to preempt, you got to hit Russia before they hit us. And, and he was saying, God, I'm not pushing that button. So he ended up with a direct communications with Khrushchev, who he himself was being pressured by his own Russian military establishment. So they found a way out of that, thank God, and so definitely he did not want to go into Vietnam. He was we know from national security action memorandums and other stuff that he was ordering a pullout of the advisors. So he had again, Jim DiEugenio on that. When you look at his policies and his foreign policy, they know that there was a sudden change after his assassination because Johnson reversed everything. He and his team were behind the Tonkin Gulf incident, which was made up to get the excuse to go to war and everything. So what you're saying is absolutely true about Kennedy. I think and he spoke with ambassadors. He spoke to a guy called Gullion, who really knew about the Vietnam situation, and told him, we can't not win that war. We can't, because we don't even know who the enemy is. We can't tell them apart. And the French are going to lose it. And if we go in, we're going to get our asses booted too. So his advisors all said that. So, often you're right. To get in, he talked about a missile gap. He was saying that the Americans were behind the Russians in terms of missiles, which was not true. But he did that in his campaigning to get elected. You won't get elected in the US if you're not tough on crime, right? And strong militarily. You have to be, in the eyes of the public. So there's a lot of bravado and a lot of talk during elections. But between that and wanting to actually go to war, and you need people who are calm, cool, and collected. And I think he was that for the reasons that you're stating. And
Well, there's a difference between being tough on crime and there's a difference between being a bully. So the issue is that when you are the bully, it's hard to recognize that.
yeah,
And I think a lot of people, I think like you'll see snippets of people saying the one thing they liked about Trump was when he handshaked people. He brought them in. There's that aggressive handshake. Now that's being tough and letting people know, like, hey, this isn't a bar to set, but it also can be taken as being a bully. And it can actually cause more damage than good. And people have to be aware of that. You want a strong leader, but you don't want someone who's going to be the person that thinks that running the world or being the head of the table is the way to get it. You get it by being fair in a sense. I know it's a dirty world and dirty business, but what you should really respect out of a leader is the qualities of fairness, and not wanting to go to war should be your first thing or your priorities. Now, that might be the sense today, in a sense of a lot of people don't want to go to war, but you still find people that call for it. And I think when you especially look at the past, I mean, the past is the best predictor. one thing that Jacob Hornberger said to me that really kind of had me digging a little bit deeper. And I know I've said it for a long time. I don't think the Illuminati's like black cloaks and all that. I think it's just someone that they found to work a system and make the system work in their favor. And you can see this through the Watergate scandal and see the decline of the CIA from there. I had a friend of William Colby, John Ranley, on this show before speak about it. Mostly that William Colby wasn't a bad guy, and I didn't think he was, but I think he became a whistleblower of the CIA and got into a lot of trouble of it. And even documents say that after that Watergate scandal, that the CIA would never recover. But I think it showed you how powerful that your government can be when they start working in a bad direction. And necessarily when you're doing bad, you don't necessarily know that you're doing bad. I mean, they were wiretapping Americans' phones. They were doing a lot of stuff that today people would just probably, be astonished at. And what Jacob Hornberger said to me, he goes, they tried to assassinate Castro. And he goes, and they deemed Castro as a threat, as he needed to be taken out. Now, if you're in the country like America and you hear that Castro was attempted to be assassinated because he's deemed as a threat, he's deemed as a madman, and they call him all these things that maybe he might not be. Maybe he's a little crazy in some aspects. But if you call him all these things, then the American public is going to stand behind what their government's doing when trying to assassinate a leader. Now, what stops them from deeming JFK a threat? All because he wanted to pull out of a war, which a lot of people at this time thought would make us weak. And this is where you get into the thing of the assassination, where we can talk about the attempts that happened prior to the one where they actually succeeded at their job. And hopefully you can enlighten me in on those, because I don't know too much about those. And that might fill in the gap of my information, but I'm not doing half bad for doing some like independent research and stuff. Holy crap. I feel like I looked into like a well that has a heaven at the bottom of it.
Well, you're doing something I think that is smart. It's a scientific method. The scientific method relies on what first? Observation, right? And you collect the data. And I like the names of the people you're talking about, like James Douglas, Jim DiEugenio, David Mantik. I think the tricky part here is there's so much out there, is what do I read? Who do I listen to? Who do I invite on my show? And, I think that you're certainly on the right track. Just a word on the Secret Service. The best researcher about the Secret Service, and I've read about 2 or 3 of his books, is Vince Palomaro. And Vince Palomaro, knows all about Abraham Bolden, for instance. And when I want to go to, okay, I don't know much about the Secret Service. Oh, let me first see what Vince Palomaro has to say. For the Tippit murder, I'm not a specialist on it, but I know there's a fellow called McBride who wrote a great book called Into the Nightmare. And, he finds a lot of anomalies. And he actually interviewed, I think, Tippit's dad. And so you can find an awful lot there. So if you hover around Kennedy's and King and look at who his authors are, you'll see David Mantik's in there. You'll see McBride. You'll find, I think Jim is pretty choosy on who his sources are. So the tricky thing for a younger person coming into it is, what sources do I read? Because I've been led down a few rabbit holes and false flags over 20 or 30 years. And I'd read a book and I'd say, okay, but then I wouldn't do the job of looking at who that person's sources were, or what his methodology was. So I ended up probably writing a few things that I think today that I'd say, oh geez, maybe I shouldn't have gone as far in that direction, on a point. So I'm becoming more and more cautious. So congratulations on approaching it that way. And yeah, here's what I'll say, Robbie, about the prior plots, why I find it super interesting. First of all, if you read the Warren Commission, you won't find a word about the prior plots, not a word. And that is a basic investigative technique, right? There's a crime. Say there was a crime in your neighborhood, and it was a weird crime or something that stood out. Well, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to ask yourself, is this part of a series of crimes? Is there something going on Did the person leave a symbol? Was there a description? Was there something that indicates that this is not a standalone incident, but something that's happening, and it's called case linkage. Criminals, when they investigate it, they try and see if there's links between cases. It's normal. And eventually, after time, they say, oh my God, we found something similar that happened in San Francisco. And then you say, whoa, boy, this person moved from San Francisco to New York and whatnot. And then they can find DNA, they can find fingerprints, they can find a witness testimony. If you look at the JFK assassination, the people who had an awful lot of information about prior plots was the Secret Service. And the Secret Service, when the ARRB came around, say, hey, you're going to declassify the information about prior plots. Well, they burned. They destroyed all their files on prior plots. Now, luckily, some independent researchers and some people had looked in. There was document, there were articles, there were things that you could find where you could piece together information on plots that led up to Dallas. And I looked into them, and I found quite a number, some that are not too well documented, but a few that are very well documented. And what you see is a template. What happened in Dallas did not happen in a vacuum. There were prior attempts with similar operational modus operandi. So when you looked at that, now here's what stood out for me, and I'll just speak generally here. In the case where the CIA or the US wanted to remove the head of another country, for instance, Guatemala, Iran, they had a executive action game plan. And that game plan was called ZR Rifle. It was written up by the American head of assassinations, a guy called William Harvey. William Harvey, he was well known. He was involved in World War II. He was known for or past World War II, actually, tunnel that made it under the Berlin Wall. And that was one of his big coups. He was often compared to, called the American James Bond, but he was a big drinker, a hothead, and he hated the Kennedys. He absolutely hated the Kennedys. But let me get back to his template. If you read ZR Rifle, they found some of his notes. And what they said is when you remove someone, you want to blame it on the opponent. You want to create a scenario where the opponent will be blamed for an action you took. So how can we get this blamed on either rebels and they always have cutoffs. They always, the CIA doesn't go in and kill anyone. They'll have a cutoff. It'll either be the mafia, it could be Cuban exiles. It'll be something where they have plausible deniability. They'll also, in the ZR Rifle plan, they'll talk about how they may have to change the files about a certain person that was involved, namely Oswald in this case. Like they had to backdate the files and look at what they said and really control the information they had on Oswald. So he wrote this. And in other words, you can almost see the removal of Kennedy as a removal of a head of state, but based on techniques that they were used to using. Like what they were trying to do to remove Castro, what they did to remove Arbenz, what they did to remove I forget the name of the person, but in Iran, and they placed the Shah in, and then they would place people that they could control. Okay, control, and it's all about protecting supply lines. They don't want to lose their supply lines of cheap food, fruit, oil. So if they want to control the supply lines, that makes companies richer. It makes America safer. So that was the formula they were using. So let's get back now to how ZR Rifle was applied in the US. Now, you remember the Fair Play for Cuba Committee? Well, Oswald I write an article that shows that when he went to Russia, okay, he went to Russia in, I think it was 1958 or 1959. He comes back in early 62. Well, that whole trek can be shown to be an intelligence operation. And you can see it by the way he learned Russian, by the way he entered the Soviet Union, the equipment he had, and his supposedly he wasn't debriefed when he left Russia, but he was. So if you look at all that went into Oswald before how he got his leave from the army, and how he even traveled to get to Russia, it all smacks of an intelligence operation. And that's something Richard Schweiker of the Church Committee famously said. He says, wherever you look with Oswald, you see the fingerprints of intelligence. So now let's go flash forward. He comes back to the United States. He settles in Dallas. And for some strange reason, he's hobnobbing with white Russians. Now, the white Russians are as right-wing as you can get. And he's supposedly a communist, right? And this doesn't make sense. So the first guy who really wrote about that was Jim Garrison. He says, boy, he's got weird friends for a communist. He's hanging around with George of Mohrenschildt and all these white Russians who hate communism. Now, while his wife is pregnant with their second child, all of a sudden he does this thing and he says, boy, I'm going to go down to New Orleans and I'm going to try and find work there. That was never fully explained why he went down to New Orleans. And then he has the weirdest summer any person ever had. What does he do? Well, actually, even before he left for New Orleans, he starts writing to the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. The key, and this is what I worked very hard on in one of my most recent articles, is I looked at who was part of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, what was their history. And look, Fair Play for Cuba Committee was founded somewhere around 1959, around when Castro took power. And it started by a bunch of intellectuals, and basically they were saying, hey, look, let's give Cuba a fair chance here. Let's not dump on them, and let's not go to war with Cuba just because Castro is communist. I'm simplifying. So they had, a few early successes. They protested the Bay of Pigs. They got involved but by the time they got involved with the missile crisis, a year before the assassination, the Fair Play for Cuba started running out of steam. It was the number of meetings, they held 20 some meetings a year, typically. I'm talking about the national headquarters in New York. And in the final year, when Oswald joins, they have about 2 or 3 meetings. During the summer, their sponsors, which included I'm trying to find, it was not the Socialist Party, but, the Communist and Socialist parties of the United States, I forget their titles exactly. They were sponsoring and helping them. They said, hey, look, let's close it down. It's not popular. It'll exist in paper only. Now, what does Oswald do? He tries to open a chapter in the worst city imaginable for having a chapter at the worst possible time. So what does that mean is New Orleans depended so much on north-south trade. And they didn't like the idea of Castro being in power because of the domino effect it could have, in their view, with their supply lines in Central America and so on and so forth. And that's what New Orleans depended on. So if you're going to choose a city, the ones you want to avoid, and the FPCC was clear about that, is you don't want to open in Miami. You don't want to open in New Orleans. Yet that's what Oswald does. He doesn't get one member. He's the only member. And he starts this chapter. Okay. And the next thing he does is, where does he set up office? He sets up office right near Guy Bannister, who is in the same building that they're having meetings and they're organizing extreme right-wing activities with Cuban exiles, okay? And he's a stone throw away with them, and he's often seen with them. And surrounding that building, you had intelligence all over the place. You had Secret Service, CIA, FBI in buildings right near where Oswald sets up his Fair Play for Cuba Committee office, because he made an error once on stamping one of his flyers, and he gave up the Camp Street address, and that gave away the whole game. So now they're saying, oh, he went from all these right-wingers in Dallas, the White Russians, and now he's hobnobbing with all these right-wingers, including his old friend, David Ferry, because David Ferry was his instructor in the Civil Air Patrol. And David Ferry worked for Guy Bannister and worked with all these Cubans, exiles. Then what does he do? He starts leafleting. At first, he kept it secret. But you know why he was leafleting at first? His job wasn't to, his job was to identify communists. That's what his job was. And he says, hey, if you take the leaflets and you call me, and then he would give those names most likely to Guy Bannister, and Guy Bannister had a Fair Play for Cuba Committee file, and even had an Oswald file. So he goes there. But something happens during the course of the summer where he would work mostly underground, and they say, hey, you know what? This became the visible Oswald. So he gets into a fight, a stage fight with Carlos Bringuier of the DRE. He gets on a radio show where he debates Carlos Bringuier, and he's doing everything to make himself visible as a Fair Play for Cuba Committee member. Now, keep in mind, this organization is dying. It's down to well under 5,000 members nationally, okay? And yet he joins. Now,
wait, just from what you said, I don't want to interrupt you, but so instead of the way that they portrayed him as being a Cuban sympathizer, is it possible that he might have been a right-wing person,
Oh,
Oswald?
yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. I think he was doing a mission. Look, he's a conflicted, complicated person who did have, who did state some certain points of view. So it's hard to know. But when he went to Russia, he was on a mission. Okay. And by the way, he went during the middle of a false defector program where there are other people of his nature that did enter that way. He's not the only one who entered Russia when he went there. There are other ex-militaries, and some were known to be what they call false defectors. He was most likely a false defector. When he joined the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, and this is where, Robbie, I studied the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. I found documents on it. The FBI was all over it. Their job when there was an organization like that was to infiltrate it and get people just like Oswald. So you have a number of these ex-military types that infiltrate the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in Tampa, in Detroit, in LA. So what Oswald is doing in New Orleans is being done all over the US. And these people are leafleting and trying to identify communists. Now, there's a precedent to that. If you recall, Oswald, when he was in Dallas before, who did they become very friendly with? I said the White Russians. But then the next babysitters were the Paynes, right? Ruth Payne and Michael Payne. And Ruth Payne and Michael Payne had files on communist sympathizers. Okay, they had files in there. They were identifying communist sympathizers, and they happened to be friends with Oswald in Dallas. Now he goes to New Orleans. Who's he chumming up with? Guy Bannister, communist hunters. That's who he's chumming up with. And what then happens, though, is there's also the possibility, because the FBI was also trying to clamp down on these very activist Cuban exiles who were very violent there. I mean, they wanted to shut down the operations against Castro after a while. This is after the missile crisis. They said, okay, let's cool it on the terrorism acts in Cuba. Let's cool it on the assassination attempts. So there is a likelihood that Oswald was reporting both on communist sympathizers and anti-Castro activity. Now, some people have speculated that he became expendable, that the Cuban exiles and a few others were onto him. And they were saying, God, this guy's a traitor. He's pretending to be on our side. He's pretending to do this, but he's actually giving information to the FBI to make our activities more difficult. That I can't document fully, but one thing's for sure is in the middle of the summer, he becomes visible and he's being set up as the patsy. He's becoming the patsy because he's the perfect patsy. Because he's now someone you can connect to Castro. The rumors are starting to come up that he's going to Mexico City. He's trying to meet the Russian head of assassinations. He's meeting Cuban agents, which is all false, by the way. But that's the scenario, the ZR rifle scenario. How can we connect him to a foe? That's what's going on throughout that summer and that trip to Mexico City, right? So that when he gets caught, we're going to say, oh, geez, he's dead now, because they wanted to assassinate him quick, not 2 days later. They wanted to assassinate Oswald the day it happened, but he survived 2 days. And then they would have said, this plan A was to say, oh, look, this guy, Oswald, yeah, they didn't mind that there was a shot from the front. They didn't mind that there would have been 3 shooters. But I guarantee you, all 3 shooters would have been pro-Castro, if they had gone that route. So just to get the idea, now, if you look at the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, okay, this organization, I'm trying to establish that it is being infested by informants by them. Now, who's another person that joins the Fair Play for Cuba or attends meetings? It's another potential patsy in Tampa. His name is Policarpo Lopez. And the FBI did find that this guy was making rumors that, he was becoming across as pro-Castro. And you know what happens a few days before the assassination? Because, Kennedy, before going to Dallas, a few days earlier, went to Miami and Tampa. But there were rumors that there'd be an attempt to kill him in Tampa. And the potential patsy happens to be Policarpo Lopez. This guy goes down to Mexico City right after the visit, the Kennedy visit, ends up being a lone passenger on a plane to Cuba. Okay? And he uses the same entry points to get to Mexico City that supposedly Oswald did, and goes through, has a relationship with some of the people Oswald did in Mexico City. The reason I bring this case up, that's one prior plot, and there are a number of them, is, of course, he happens to have attended Fair Play for Cuba committee meetings shortly before. Now, the coincidence of that, given how weak the Fair Play for Cuba committee was, that Oswald and Policarpo Lopez, okay, one potential patsy and the other one a patsy, that finally came out by the House Select Committee on Assassinations. And they say, you know what? The Warren Commission didn't even look into this guy. And the fact that he left the way Oswald tried to get into Cuba, the fact that he was part of the Fair Play for Cuba committee, it's egregious that we didn't look into that. Now, there are other cases. We talked about Abraham Bolden. That occurred less than a month before the Dallas assassination. Kennedy was to go to Chicago. And one of the Secret Service people in charge of the security in Chicago was Abraham Bolden. And what you said earlier is exactly right. What did he see? Lacks security. He witnessed things. There was rumors. They actually had 4 Cubans that were headed up with rifles to kill Kennedy. That made it to the FBI. A landlady saw the 4 Cubans with rifles and maps of the motorcade, and she reported that to the FBI. The FBI passed on the information to the Secret Service. The Secret Service botches the surveillance, but do pick up 2 of the Cubans or Latinos. And they can't get any information out of the 2 Cubans. Let's say, some say they're Puerto Rican, and we have no pictures of them, and they end up letting them go. But at the same time in Chicago, there's another guy called Thomas Arthur Valle. This guy was in Long Island, and they move him to Chicago. He's a bit of a nut. I mean, he's an ex-Marine. He had gone to Japan like Oswald. He had been involved in sort of activities similar to Oswald. And next thing you know, this guy is moved into a building that looks like the Texas School Book Depository, exactly in a venue where Kennedy would have traveled and would have had to do a weird turn, slow down, right? But Kennedy ended up canceling that trip because there were just too many rumors of assassination attempts that could take place. So you have another weird guy in Valley that is so similar to Oswald. Now I'm going to go in another one. In June, there was a guy, Kennedy was supposed to have been killed in a movie theater in LA during the showing of the book about his war heroics. And the patsy there would have been the head of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee chapter in LA, a guy called Von Marlowe. And that one's not as documented as Chicago and Tampa, but those are, you see, so when you look at case linkage, what you see, Robbie, is a template that resembles ZR rifle. That is, hey, we've got the people that will allow us to blame it on Cuba. Okay, now some are well documented, some are semi-documented. And look, there are other cases. I've named you 3, but there's at least 5 or 6 other instances that are really bizarre also, that would have allowed the same sort of scenario that could have allowed Plan A to succeed. Plan A, again, was the CIA and American military industrial complex wanting to retake the island of Cuba and invading. That was nixed by Johnson. Johnson said, no, we're not doing that. We'll go into Vietnam, but we're not going to go with Cuba. The missile crisis was a year earlier. We don't want a world war there on this. So I don't know if
you did, but
if that gives you an idea of what that area of research that I talked to you about, the articles, if you read them in Kennedy's and King, I actually create a profile of about 9 or 10 people that have so many similarities to Oswald, 7 of which are connected to the almost dead Fair Play for Cuba Committee, many of them ex-Marines, many of them tried to enter Mexico, Cuba through Mexico. So that's what the Prior Plots article is about, and that's what I was interviewed on by Oliver Stone.
Could I toss out a hypothetical? It's going to link down into the same scenario either way, because I'm trying to understand why Oswald was at that where they did catch him, even just in that general area, but also trying to understand the same time why would oh God, I want to blank on his name, the mafia guy who killed Oswald. Jack Ruby. Why Jack Ruby would kill him. And here's kind of where I go with this. So when we talk about, you could either pin Oswald to make him look as a Cuban sympathizer or some type of person who is betraying his country, which throughout a lot of these documents, you'll find that double agent, possibly all these types of talks that were getting thrown around the room, whether it was the Warren Commission or the later review of it. One thing I can't, if we go down the Cuban sympathizer route, then it's easy to have what I look at as the lone gunman theory. The one person killed the president. In my opinion, you can easily, well, not my opinion, but some evidence. There's a shot that hit from the front when it hit the windshield. So that goes, okay, so there are at least two shooters. So I get to this point of, God, I'm gonna blank on his name again. He just said it a second ago, the mafia guy. Yeah, Jack Ruby. So is this maybe just my own evidence? And you can kind of look at it through both ways, whether you're going to label him as a Cuban sympathizer or whether you want to look at him as a right-wing person, because a lot of the right wing that I've heard from Jacob Hornberger was filled in the Secret Service. And that goes to Oliver Stone's idea of clearing house. JFK never cleared house like he should have. He should have took out the old committee and put a new one in there, because a lot of people didn't agree with him. Partially, especially with Abraham Bolden's account of the story as well, too, that the Secret Service, a lot of the members were right wing that did not agree with the way that JFK was running things. You can tackle it from two angles, the Cuban sympathizer angle, or you can tackle it from the right wing theory that they used Oswald saying you need to kill the president or you need to shoot the president. But here's where where I start bringing in, where it brings in Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby out of nowhere comes up and stabs Oswald, or shoots Oswald. Yeah, shoots Oswald. So I get to this point where you ask the question, why would Jack Ruby shoot Oswald? Mafia connections. People would look at it, maybe he was a patriot trying to get back for killing the president. I doubt it. He was in the mafia. There's no way. So that means they had mafia connections. Where I link into this point where I go, maybe Jack Ruby was one of the people that fired off a shot at the president. At the same time, Oswald was set up there to do the same exact thing. Oswald was the one that became the patsy, and Jack Ruby was going to lose all the, they were going to pay him something to be the patsy. They were going to, for being the fall guy, you get compensation. Your family gets, you get respect, you get a bunch of things that the mafia likes, but also your family gets taken care of. So him now realizing that he's not going to get that payment that was offered, or hypothetical, like I said, it's my own little hypothetical scenario, that he's not going to get that money that's going to be going to his family. It's now going to be Oswald. They already got the guy taking the fall. It's kind of like if I told you to pick me up at 10:30, but I didn't think you were going to come through, I would call somebody else at the same time and see which person shows up, like ordering an Uber. So I go, you had two assassins that were trying to get the president. In case one failed, another one you couldn't have two failures, right? You would only have one. One person would miss, but the president would still be dead. But then now Jack Ruby, realizing Oswald's getting the blame of killing the president and his family's not going to be compensated, he might as well kill Oswald, and at least his family will still get compensated. Maybe. I mean, it's a hypothetical, but it's the way I'm looking at it and I'm thinking about it. I'm like, that's a really good freaking plan, man, to have to take out the lone gunman theory. It doesn't make sense. Some people want to believe it, whatever. I'm not saying they're wrong, but at the same time I am. But I'm going to this point where I go, if you get two people to try and kill the president, it's best to have those two people that were going to kill the president in your pocket, instead of maybe blaming Oswald as a Cuban sympathizer. Maybe it's because most of the right wing was already in the Secret Service talking about, well, how would you assassinate the president anyway? And then the way that they said that they were going to do it, they did do it. You go, okay, if the Secret Service wanted to go to war, or maybe the whole government agency wanted to do war, and JFK was the one that was backing out, so he was seen as a problem, or you deem him as a threat and need to take him out. Imagine having two shooters trying to attempt to kill the president. In case one fails, the other one succeeds. And then Jack Ruby was like, wait, my family still got to get the money. So in his anger, kills Oswald.
Well, first of all, Jack Ruby, you're right. Some people have looked into him. One of the first people was a guy called Cantor, Kantor, and he's written some pretty interesting stuff, because you have to understand who Jack Ruby was, right? And you have to get into his background. So Jack Ruby actually started his, he wanted to be a made man, you know, he was a small time mafia connected guy, but he was doing things to ingratiate himself. And he definitely was involved with the mafia. Just give me one quick second. And let me explain. He started off up in Chicago under Al Capone, very indirectly, very small person.
I can hear that, Paul.
Oh, sorry, you don't hear it?
No, I can hear your phone vibrating on. Never mind. Stopped.
It just stopped. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so he heads down to Dallas. He starts a few strip joints with his sister, Eva. And he starts, one of them being the Carousel Club. His dealings there bring him to have to be somewhat involved with the Marcello family, because when you're hiring strippers and it's kind of linked. One of the things he tries to do, and this is definite, he tries to spring Santo Trafficante from a Cuban jail, and he goes to Cuba. And Santo Trafficante and Carlos Marcello are some of the mafia people that are the most connected in the story of the assassination. What was the mafia component in this whole thing? So he tries to spring Trafficante, and he figures by springing this guy who was at the time, when Cuba was being run by the mafia, well, you had, the network of CIA, Cuban mafia, American mafia, and Cuban exiles. There were almost a little network in Cuba. And then Castro takes over. Well, all these people are booted either into jail or off the island, and they coalesce in Miami, most of them, some in Dallas, some in New Orleans. So when you look at Jack Ruby, I believe what he was being told is, hey, look, you're our guy, because he probably was in the know about the assassination. He had many ins with the Dallas police. The Dallas police, many of them went to his Carousel Club, and he'd offer them free drinks, women, you wouldn't believe it. So for him to have made it into, the place where they were keeping Oswald, because he was stalking Oswald for 2 days there, 3 days. You even have him on camera there. You can hear him actually correcting the DA, Wade, saying, DA said that Oswald was part of the Free Cuba Committee. And you can see on YouTube, if you want, Ruby correcting Wade, saying, no, that's the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. He corrects them, not the journalist, anyone. So we're saying, what the heck is this small-time mafia guy doing? So he was working on trying to eliminate Oswald. He was under orders to do so. The reason he did it, I think that you're right. He had debts, and they offered to pay off his debts. He did run into some money, and I think they said, you know what, you're going to get off of this as a patriot. You'll have killed the killer of the president, and you're going to be able to say that it was, temporary insanity. So you should get off pretty easy. And you better do it, Jack. You better do it. So his first visitor when he was in jail was the top guy in Dallas, a mafioso, the top guy, and basically saying, you better keep your mouth shut, thank you for doing it. Here's what we're going to do. We don't know what they said, but they analyzed Ruby's phone calls to the weeks leading up to the assassination. And the number of phone calls that he makes to mafia-connected figures during the buildup is ridiculous. So even the HSCA, when they looked into that, said, look, Ruby's not this guy who killed Oswald because, he felt bad for Jackie Kennedy and wanted to spare her, all the effort of coming down to a trial in Dallas. That was the ridiculous excuse that was given for the Ruby assassinating Oswald. There are quite a few sightings that aren't proven, but that Oswald and Ruby knew one another. Okay, there's a lot of argument to that effect. Quite a few people who claim to have seen them together, including some of the strippers in the Carousel Club and others. But let me tell you what I think.
Well, my speculations aren't bad though, right? Because like,
No, they're
okay,
not bad. I mean, I think you can make an argument there in cahoots. I would not think that he was a shooter though, because the shooters,
how did he get there?
well, it occurred. He wasn't. His claim to his whereabouts when the shooting took place was that he was uh, at the news media where he's placing ads for the Carousel Club. And mind you, you're right. There was a sighting of someone who looked very closely like Ruby at Daily Plaza too. So it's not clear where he was, but look, I think he was in the know. I think he you know uh, he was forced into having to take him out, because I think the plan was to take out Oswald and not let him survive 48 hours. They did not want this guy to talk. They did not want Oswald to talk for sure. But look, if you read Larry Hancock, he wrote a book called
Yeah,
Tipping.
he's been on the show. He's
Oh,
supposed to.
he's great.
I
And
was gonna get me, you, and him and Jim all in one
oh yeah,
chat.
no, Larry and I talk quite a bit. And talked to Larry about the training that was being done in Miami during the period leading up to the assassination. I'm pretty convinced that he's fingered the trainers of the assassination. Okay, and these are the people in charge of assassinations for the CIA, and they were training Cuban exiles. Okay, and there is a mafia component in Johnny Rosselli, if you recall that name, who was very close to that gang in Miami of the CIA. And if you want to go that route, I feel that Larry's on to something with Bill Simpich and a few others who've really looked into, because there's a New Orleans component to the assassination. There's a Miami component. Try and think of it this way, Robbie. There's two things. There's a logistics of getting him killed through triangulation of fire. That's a lot of training. Okay. And that's a lot of planning. And there was a similar attempt on Castro later when he went to Mexico City. They were looking at a possibility of triangulation of fire. That is most likely an operation that was done under people like a guy called Morales, who was another guy who hated Kennedy, and he was the top killer for the CIA. He was part of taking out Che Guevara, okay, in Chile, or is it Chile or Bolivia? Anyway, I'm not sure. Not in Chile, in one of those South American states. And if you look at him and people like Tony Sforza, and that's where Larry Hancock's really strong.
Yeah, he sent me his information about his
Yeah,
book that he wrote.
yeah, and that to me. I think he's onto something. Now, the second component that I think I've written quite a bit on is the whole propaganda side, the whole side to say, okay, here's the storyline. And you have people in the CIA who are really good at that. Two of the most important people during some of these takeovers and these wars and these were David Atlee Phillips, who was, I mean, he was in Mexico City when the fake Oswald went there. And he's clearly involved in all these lies around the tapes and the photos and everything. David Atlee Phillips, I'll tell you why he's interesting. There are so many touch points between David Atlee Phillips and Oswald, it's ridiculous. For instance, he was in charge of surveying and controlling, or how could I put it, all the dirty tricks around the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. It was David Atlee Phillips.
Manipulation.
And you know that guy Oswald got into a fight with, Carlos Bringuier, and later went on the radio with? Well, Carlos Bringuier was the head of the DRE in Oswald. It was a Cuban exile group, okay, called the DRE. Now, you know who set up the DRE? David Atlee Phillips. Okay. So now you have David Atlee Phillips. And by the way, those are only two. So you have David Atlee Phillips. Think about that. Controlling the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, intelligence and activities. And you have David Atlee Phillips, who's involved with the DRE. And then I could get into another group called Alpha 66 that also interacts with Oswald. And he set up Alpha 66. I mean, there's so many touch points. Another guy is Lansdale, Richard Lansdale, who is Mr. Scenario for an operation where you can have all of a sudden a revolution or whatever, but we'll blame it on the communists somehow. Okay, so if you look at these two lines of operation, one, the propaganda side, and you look into David Atlee Phillips and you know, stuff I and others have written about, and then you look at the operational side, which is, okay, how do we actually take him out? And these people, by the way, are used to working together. Morales and David Atlee Phillips knew one another. They were closely linked when they removed Arbenz. Larry Hancock calls it a cadre of like-minded CIA operatives who know how to do regime change. And I would bet that the shooters, you know, it would be really experienced people, snipers, okay, that are under that training operation that took place in the Keys and Miami, and I think Larry's onto something really interesting there. And I think what you want to do now to understand the assassination, try and think of it this way. If you want to go back, you have two really good researchers that pushed the case forward and got into trouble for it. On the whole New Orleans side, it was Jim Garrison. And that's why I'm reading his Garrison files and finding incredible stuff in them. But it's thousands of pages. And Garrison comes up and he says, you know what he did here with Bannister, with David Ferry, with, you know, and he starts aligning that. And this trip to Mexico City stinks. Okay. That's one. And under that, you have disciples of Garrison. And these would include people like William Davey, Jim DiEugenio. Okay. They took his work and they went and questioned witnesses and they read his stuff. And that's how you get the movie JFK, right? Under Oliver Stone, and then the documentary. Then your other key person, and don't forget this name, is Gaetan Fonzi. Gaetan Fonzi was a sleuth. Like, he was the best investigator for both the Church Committee and the House Select Committee in assassinations. Not only did he find this whole David Atlee Phillips link and turned him into an extremely important person, but he was on to what was going on in Miami. And he says there's something going on around JM Wave. There's what went on in JM Wave with the Cuban exiles, the CIA and the mafia coalesced into into people that were behind the assassination. And he was onto it. And who are his disciples? Bill Simpich, Larry Hancock. And if you connect the two, if you connect the whole Fonzie, Garrison schools of thought, and now we're linking them more and more because we're finding more and more links of people that were in New Orleans and people that were in Miami. We're seeing them through the DRE, we're seeing them through the Alpha 66, we're seeing them through JM Wave, a guy called George Joannides, who replaced David Atlee Phillip. He was in Miami, but he shows up in New Orleans and he's working with the DRE, guys like Carlos Bringuier, when the assassination takes place. And what does George Joannides end up doing? He ends up being the person that was assigned by the CIA when the House Select Committee on Assassinations was making so much progress. They say, hey, he's your new contact for the CIA, for our documents and everything. He shut the door because when he went in, it was getting so hot what the people were finding. They had to shut the door. They chose the guy, George Joannides, who was right in the thick of things in New Orleans before the assassination. And So I'm kind of throwing a lot at you right
Yeah,
now.
we're gonna have to do a whole panel. Like I said, I'm gonna try and get everybody in
Oh,
to
you
talk
get
about this.
Larry, you get Jim, you get me, you get a few others, and we'll have a very interesting discussion.
Yeah.
But I think if you read Destiny Betrayed by Jim DiEugenio, and you read Tipping Point by Larry Hancock, and maybe read a few of my articles on Kennedy's and King about the Fair Play for Cuba Committee and the prior plots, you're going to start getting, you talked about Jim Douglas and The Unspeakable. That's an amazing book. Okay. So because the danger you have right now is you're going through a funnel of information. And if I would suggest to you that talk to people like me, Jim and Larry, and say, what should I read? What's the thing? And you'll see that you'll get a little bit farther away from the backyard photos. You'll even get a little bit farther away from the Zapruder film. You're going to get away from the idea of let's prove there was a conspiracy. No, let's figure out what it was. Okay? Because all the things that prove there was a conspiracy, I can give you 12 chokeholds and you can say, okay, I've heard enough. In Destiny Betrayed, the documentary, the whole chain of custody around the bullets is insane, right? So that to me, if you want to do it, though, keep looking at that, because phase one, you're going to say, oh yeah, there's a conspiracy and the Warren Commission was BS, right? But phase two is what did in fact happen? Okay. And when you get into phase two, those are the people. If you read Destiny Betrayed, it really impressed upon me. And The Unspeakable, another one, David Talbot, The Devil's Chessboard. You have to read that. The Devil's Chessboard talks about Allen Dulles. And Allen Dulles, what happened after Kennedy fired him? What did he do for those few years? And how does he link with all this? And I think there you're going to leapfrog, okay, a whole bunch of stuff, and then you're going to get into. But you're doing exactly the right thing. You're talking to people like me. And you can listen. You can discard a few things I did and make a judgment, but that's going to really, really help your. But you know what? I like the names of the people you talked about that you're talking to and the panel you want to make. And if ever you want me on a panel, I'll be more than happy to join it. And,
Yeah, I want to. We can talk off air about setting up a future date. I want to make sure that, especially if you have any resources or anything too, people that I have a guest list I can name off to you after this, and then you'll be able to tell me who would be good for a conversation with everybody. Because I get everybody has various opinions, but I think on this one, you all see I'm really trying my hardest to be able.
Oh no, your instincts are great. Okay, and your whereabouts on, trying to figure out Tippett and Ruby, the key in here is who was Tippett, who was Ruby, who was Oswald. You're doing a good job. Find out who they were, and then, but the biggest danger I had when I first started is saying, well, exactly what you're saying. What is reliable and what isn't? If you knew how much time I wasted on the Torbit document, and now, and for a while I say, oh my God, I don't believe, or Judith Very Baker stuff. I read her book, and I wouldn't say that it's totally. I did find some interesting things in it, but and then of course there was Madeline Brown, the mistress of Lyndon Johnson, and what she had to say about Lyndon Johnson's involvement and all that. And then all of a sudden you say, oh God, how much time did I wait? I spent too many hours on that. Okay, so the big thing is, what are the rabbit holes and what brings you closer to your goal? Jim DiEugenio brings you closer to your goal. Oliver Stone brings you closer to your goal. Larry Hancock.
The goal is to get Oliver Stone on here. That's my childhood hero.
He's coming to Quebec City.
I know. You're lucky.
I'm so happy that he'll be here in a couple of weeks. If ever you're in town, let me know. I'll send you an invitation to. Where are you living in Washington right now? Or?
I live in Maryland, which is a couple hours away from Washington, D.C.
Yeah. Okay. I've been there. Well, I'm trying to think of Maryland, but My interview was in Washington.
But Paul, where can people find your links? Kennedy's and King's site. We know you have articles linked in there as well too. Do you have it? I followed your Twitter, but I don't think you're active on there.
No, I'm not that active. I'm on LinkedIn a lot.
Oh, that's your LinkedIn.
I don't have a website. I not yet. Because I have a full-time job teaching.
Yeah.
But I'm starting to clear up a bit more time because
Good.
I'm writing an article right now on the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. I wrote 2 parts on it, and I found from the Garrison files, I'm going to be writing a series of articles on what do the Garrison files tell us. I wouldn't recommend that, I would the books I would recommend: Destiny Betrayed, Tipping Point. Vince Palomara has some nice things on the Fair Play for Cuba, on the Secret Service. He's someone you want to meet for sure, and I can send you an email with my name if ever you want to interview him.
Yeah.
I'll send you information about the event, and if ever you're in the area,
Yeah. I'm gonna link all your links in the description. We're gonna talk off air in a second anyway. But it's been a pleasure. Thanks for listening to this episode. Out of the